Chapter 1. The World on Edge. Europe under Nazi rule. The year is 1944, and Europe is a continent drowning in shadows. For nearly 5 years, Adolf Hitler's Third Reich has stretched its iron grip across the heart of the continent. From the coastlines of France to the vast plains of Eastern Europe, the swastika flies defiantly over conquered lands. Entire nations lie under German occupation, broken, humiliated, and suffocated by the machinery of tyranny. Paris, once a city of light and laughter, now marches in silence beneath jackboots. Warsaw is scarred and burned, its people forced into ghettos, its resistance movements hunted down. Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, all are chained to Berlin's will. And in the East, the Soviet Union bleeds endlessly, fighting a brutal war of survival against the Nazi war machine. But for Hitler, one victory remains incomplete: Britain. Though battered, bombed, and bruised, the small island has refused to surrender. Winston Churchill's defiance has kept the flame of resistance alive, even as much of Europe lies in ruin. And from that island fortress, an idea is born, an idea so bold, so risky, that if it fails, the Allies may never again get another chance to strike back. That idea is D-Day. The stakes of the war: by 1944, the Allies know the clock is ticking. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, is demanding relief on the Eastern Front. His Red Army has endured catastrophic losses, but is pushing back the Wehrmacht inch by inch. Still, without a second front in the West, Stalin warns that millions more may die. He needs the Allies to strike at Germany directly, to split Hitler's forces in two. For Britain and America, the challenge is monumental. How do you take back an entire continent that has been fortified for years? How do you breach Hitler's so-called Atlantic Wall, a massive line of bunkers, artillery, and defenses stretching from Norway down to Spain? The answer lies in an operation that will demand more men, more ships, and more firepower than anything ever attempted in human history. It is an operation that, if it succeeds, could mark the beginning of the end of the Nazi Empire. If it fails, it could plunge the war into darkness for years to come. Hitler's fortress Europe, the Germans, know the Allies will strike. It is not a matter of if, but where and when. Hitler has poured enormous resources into defending his Western Front. He names it Festung Europa, Fortress Europe. Thousands of concrete bunkers are poured into the sands and cliffs of the French coast. Artillery guns point out toward the English Channel, ready to tear apart any approaching fleet. Mines, barbed wire, steel obstacles known as Czech hedgehogs, and miles upon miles of trenches turn the beaches into death traps. Overseeing this defense is one of Germany's most famous generals, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. After his campaigns in North Africa, Rommel knows the importance of mobility, speed, and decisive action. But now his task is different. He must stop an invasion before it gains ground. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive, Rommel warns. The fate of Germany depends on it. A continent waiting meanwhile, across occupied Europe, millions wait for salvation. In the French countryside, resistance fighters, known as the Maquis, secretly sabotage German supply lines, gather intelligence, and prepare for the day when the Allies will return. Radio broadcasts from London whisper encouragement, urging them to hold on. The liberation will come, they say, but fear hangs over every town and village. The Gestapo hunts traitors ruthlessly. Anyone caught aiding the resistance faces torture or execution. Families hide in shadows, waiting for the sound of Allied planes, hoping for a signal that freedom is near. The hope across the Channel in England, the buildup is impossible to hide. Entire counties are transformed into giant military camps. American soldiers arrive in endless convoys. Young men from Kansas, Texas, New York, and California, strangers in a foreign land, now preparing for the most dangerous mission of their lives. British, Canadian, Polish, French free forces, and others join them. Nearly every nation that has suffered under Hitler's conquest contributes men to the coming storm. Villages fill with tents. Roads rumble under the weight of tanks and trucks. Airfields roar with the thunder of bombers and fighters. The English countryside is no longer peaceful. It is a staging ground for liberation. And yet, secrecy is absolute. The men know something enormous is coming, but few know the details. Orders are whispered, sealed in envelopes, guarded by military police. To the common soldier, one question hangs in the air. When will it begin? The gamble of history the Allies face a brutal calculation. The English Channel is a narrow stretch of water, but crossing it with an army of hundreds of thousands is no small feat. Storms can scatter ships, waves can swamp landing craft, and German U-boats can prowl beneath the surface. A failed landing would not only cost lives, it would shatter morale, embolden Hitler, and possibly give him the time he needs to finish new weapons like the V-2 rocket or jet-powered aircraft. It is in every sense a gamble of history, but leaders like General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, understand the stakes. The eyes of the world are upon us, he will one day say. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. As spring turns to summer in 1944, the world holds its breath. Europe waits in chains. The Allies gather in silence. And Hitler, confident in his Atlantic Wall, believes no army can break it. He does not yet know that within weeks, the largest invasion force in history will descend upon France, and the fate of the world will hang in the balance. Chapter 2. The Gamble of Liberation. Planning Operation Overlord. The invasion of Europe was not born in a single night. It was the result of years of preparation, arguments, and impossible choices. By 1943, as Allied troops fought in North Africa and Italy, the pressure mounted. The Western powers had to open a second front in France. Without it, the Soviets might collapse under the relentless German onslaught. And if that happened, Hitler's empire could stretch unchecked across the continent. The mission was given a name, Operation Overlord. The weight of command at the head of this operation stood a man who carried the burden of history on his shoulders, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. A calm, steady leader, Eisenhower was chosen as supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force not because he was the most flamboyant general, but because he could do what few others could, hold together a coalition of allies who often disagreed on everything. The British wanted caution. They had bled through years of war and feared another catastrophe like Dunkirk. The Americans wanted speed. They had the resources, the manpower, and the confidence that came from being fresh to the battlefield. The Canadians, Poles, and Free French demanded their chance to strike back at the occupier. It was Eisenhower's job to unify these voices into one plan. Beneath him, commanders like General Bernard Montgomery, bold and ambitious, and General Omar Bradley, steady and methodical, wrestled with the tactical details. The naval armada was entrusted to Admiral Bertram Ramsay, while the skies would belong to Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee-Mallory. It was a war council drawn from every corner of the Allied world, and together they faced the most daunting task in military history. Where to strike? The first great question was where to land. France's northern coast stretched for hundreds of miles, but not all of it was suitable for an invasion. Pas-de-Calais was the shortest crossing from England to France, and it seemed the obvious choice. Its beaches were wide, flat, and close to Germany. But that was the problem. It was too obvious. The Germans had heavily fortified it, expecting the Allies to strike there. Brittany, further to the west, offered excellent ports. But it was too far from Germany, and it would take too long for Allied forces to advance inland. That left Normandy, a region with sandy beaches, sheltered landing grounds, and proximity to key roads and towns. Its geography was less predictable, and its defenses, while strong, were not impenetrable. The choice was made. Normandy would be the point of the spear. The scale of the impossible, once the landing site was chosen, the sheer scale of the operation became clear. To succeed, the Allies would need to move over 150,000 troops across the Channel on the first day alone, supported by thousands of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. More than 5,000 ships would be required, warships to bombard the coast, landing craft to carry men ashore, supply ships to feed and fuel the army. In the skies, thousands of bombers and fighters would need to dominate the air, destroying German defenses and preventing reinforcements from moving in. Paratroopers would have to drop behind enemy lines to cut off roads and bridges. Engineers would have to clear mines, demolish barriers, and build new paths through chaos. Nothing on this scale had ever been attempted in human history. The fear of disaster, yet behind every bold plan, was the whisper of disaster. Memories of Dieppe, 1942, haunted the planners. That raid, meant to test German defenses, had ended in tragedy. Thousands of Canadian soldiers killed or captured in just a few hours. If Dieppe had been a small raid, what would happen in a full-scale invasion? The cost of failure was clear. If the beaches could not be secured, the Allies would be pushed back into the sea. The entire operation would collapse, leaving Hitler triumphant. And it would be years, if ever, before another chance could be attempted. Eisenhower understood this better than anyone. Quietly, in his pocket, he wrote a note before the invasion, a statement taking full responsibility if the landing failed. In it, he admitted the troops had done their best, but that the responsibility for the failure is mine alone. It was a glimpse into the crushing weight he carried, a burden few men would ever face. The secret war, but planning the invasion wasn't only about soldiers and ships, it was also about secrecy and deception. If Hitler guessed where the Allies would land, he could concentrate his forces and crush the invasion before it even began. So the Allies launched Operation Bodyguard, a massive deception campaign. They created entire phantom armies, complete with fake tanks, trucks, and radio chatter, to convince the Germans that the real invasion would come at Calais. They even employed double agents, feeding misinformation to German intelligence. Inflatable tanks were parked in English fields, and false signals lit up the skies. The deception worked brilliantly. Hitler and his generals became convinced that Normandy was only a diversion, and that the real attack would come later at Calais. That belief would prove fatal when the invasion finally began. The countdown by the spring of 1944, everything was in place. The ships were gathered. The men were trained. Maps of Normandy were studied until every hedgerow, every beach, and every village was memorized. Models of the coastline were built so soldiers could practice their assault. Resistance fighters in France received coded radio messages, telling them to prepare for sabotage. All that remained was to wait for the signal. But one enemy remained beyond Hitler, beyond the Wehrmacht, beyond the guns of the Atlantic Wall: the weather. The English Channel was treacherous, prone to sudden storms and high winds. A landing in bad weather could doom the invasion before it began. For weeks, meteorologists studied cloud patterns and wave conditions, knowing that a single mistake could cost thousands of lives. And then, in early June 1944, the reports came in. There would be a brief window of calm seas and clear skies. It was a gamble, but it was the only chance they would get. Eisenhower gave the order. The greatest gamble of the war was about to begin. Chapter 3. The Deception Game. Fooling Hitler's war machine war is not only fought with bullets and bombs, it is also fought with shadows, whispers, and lies. If the Allies were to storm the beaches of France and survive, they had to do more than prepare an army. They had to make Hitler look the wrong way at the very moment his empire's survival depended on seeing the truth. That meant building the greatest deception in military history. Operation Bodyguard, the plan, was called Operation Bodyguard, a sprawling web of lies that stretched across Europe. Its purpose was simple yet vital: convince Hitler that the Allies would land not at Normandy, but somewhere else entirely. The most logical target was Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. It was only a few dozen miles from Britain's southern ports, and it provided a direct route into Germany. The Germans were certain this would be the invasion site. The Allies decided to feed that certainty until it blinded them. From this grew a deception within the deception, Operation Fortitude. The Phantom Army in southern England, the Allies built an army that did not exist. It was called the 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, and it was commanded, on paper, by none other than General George S. Patton. To the Germans, Patton was the Allies' most aggressive, dangerous commander. Wherever Patton was, they assumed the real attack would come. But Patton's army was a mirage. Its tanks were inflatable rubber shells. Its trucks were wooden cutouts. Its landing craft were nothing more than canvas stretched over frames. Airfields were painted onto fields, and fake radio operators sent endless streams of messages about non-existent divisions. From the air, German reconnaissance planes saw what looked like a massive buildup opposite Calais. To them, it was undeniable. The Allies would strike at Calais. The double agents, the deception, didn't stop with fake tanks. The Allies had spent years building a network of double agents, spies who had convinced the Germans they were loyal, but who secretly worked for Britain. This network, known as the double-cross system, became the lifeline of the deception. One agent, codenamed Garbo, sent hundreds of false reports to the Germans. He built an entire fictional spy ring across England, complete with dozens of fake sub-agents who never existed. Through him, the Germans received a flood of carefully crafted lies, troop movements toward Dover, supply shipments staged for Calais, and even rumors that Normandy was nothing more than a diversion. The Germans believed every word. They carried rifles, grenades, demolition charges, everything needed to strike deep behind enemy lines. Many were barely 20 years old. Yet within hours, they would jump into the darkness of occupied France, alone and surrounded. Letters to home, the waiting was the hardest part. Soldiers had trained for months, memorized maps, and studied beach layouts. But now, on the eve of battle, there was nothing left to do but think. Some wrote letters to loved ones, scribbling hurried words in dim candlelight. To my dearest wife, if you are reading this, it means I didn't come home, but know I went with courage. Others wrote to mothers, to fathers, to children they had never met. Many tucked those letters into their jackets, hoping they would never need to be delivered. Chaplains moved quietly through the ranks, offering blessings, prayers, and a steady hand on the shoulder. Cigarettes glowed in the dark as men smoked nervously, sharing quiet conversations about baseball games, farms back home, or the streets of towns they had left behind. And in the silence of their thoughts, each soldier wrestled with the same truth. By tomorrow's dawn, many of them would be dead. Eisenhower's visit as midnight approached, General Eisenhower made his rounds. He visited the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, their faces painted in streaks of green and black. Cameras captured the moment. Eisenhower, smiling warmly, speaking to young soldiers who would soon jump into the fire. He asked them about their homes, their families, their hopes. He spoke with calm confidence, though inside, he carried the weight of history. He knew that within hours, these men would be the first to fight, and many would not return. Yet he gave them what they needed most, reassurance. The eyes of the world are upon you, he had told them in his order of the day. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. The paratroopers gamble at 11 p.m. Engines roared to life across the airfields. Hundreds of transport planes began to take off, their wings glinting in the moonlight. Inside, paratroopers sat in silence, helmets on, parachutes strapped, fingers clutching rifles. The planes flew low over the channel, buffeted by winds, their cabins rattling with turbulence. Some soldiers grew sick, clutching their helmets as the air grew thin. Others closed their eyes, whispering silent prayers. When the red light flicked on above the door, hearts pounded. The jumpmaster shouted, "Stand up, hook up." Metal clicks echoed as parachute lines snapped into place. Men shuffled toward the door, the cold night air blasting in their faces. Then came the green light. One by one, they leapt into the void. The sky over Normandy lit with streaks of anti-aircraft fire. Explosions rocked the night as tracer rounds zipped past the descending paratroopers. Many were scattered far from their drop zones, landing in swamps, rivers, and fields miles from their units. Some drowned under the weight of their gear. Others were captured immediately. Yet across the French countryside, small bands of paratroopers began their mission, blowing bridges, cutting communications, ambushing patrols. They were the first Allied soldiers to set foot in occupied France. The fleet moves meanwhile. At sea, the Great Armada began its journey. Ships slipped silently out of harbors, their decks packed with men staring into the black horizon. The water churned with the wake of thousands of vessels, a sight unseen in all of human history. Naval guns stood ready. Landing craft bobbed in tow. In the distance, destroyers and battleships loomed like shadows on the waves. The sea was rough, and many soldiers grew seasick, clutching their stomachs as they tried to rest on the rocking decks. Above them, squadrons of aircraft thundered across the sky, their engines a constant roar. Bombers struck coastal defenses, while fighters patrolled for German planes. The night sky glowed faintly with explosions along the French coast. The Germans wait on the other side of the channel. German soldiers sat in their bunkers along the Atlantic Wall. Many were conscripts from occupied nations, Poles, Czechs, Russians, forced to fight for Germany. Others were hardened veterans of years of war. But even here, the night seemed ordinary. Patrols walked the beaches. Searchlights swept the waves. Few expected the invasion to come tonight. Most assumed the storm had delayed any attack for weeks. In fact, Hitler himself was asleep in his bed, and his commanders dared not wake him. The deception of Calais still lingered. The Germans waited for the real invasion, blind to the Armada already on its way. The weight of silence for the soldiers of the Allied fleet, the night dragged endlessly. Some tried to sleep, curled on wooden decks, helmets under their heads. Others stared at photographs of wives or sweethearts. The silence was broken only by the steady drone of engines and the crash of waves. At 3 a.m., as the coastline of France drew closer, the men began to stir. Packs were adjusted, rifles checked, helmets tightened. A cold wind swept across the decks, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke from the bombardment already underway. They knew what awaited them: machine guns, artillery, death. Yet none turned back. The night was ending. The dawn would bring fire. In just a few hours, the beaches of Normandy would run red. Chapter 5. The Sky Falls. Paratroopers behind enemy lines. The first blow of D-Day did not come with the roar of landing craft or the thunder of naval guns. It came in silence, from the dark sky above occupied France. In the earliest hours of June 6th, 1944, before the sun had even touched the horizon, thousands of Allied paratroopers jumped into the blackness, carried by wind and fate into the heart of Hitler's Fortress Europe. Operation Neptune. The airborne gamble, the airborne assault, was one of the most daring elements of Operation Neptune, the combat phase of Overlord. 2 U.S. divisions, the 82nd and the 101st Airborne, were tasked with dropping into the Cotentin Peninsula near Utah Beach. Their mission: secure the roads, destroy key bridges, and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. To the east, British and Canadian paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division would land near the River Orne. Their objectives included capturing bridges, silencing artillery batteries, and holding the eastern flank. In total, over 20,000 airborne troops were launched into the skies of Normandy. They were the vanguard, the spearhead of the greatest invasion in history. The drop into chaos, the plan was bold, but war has little mercy for plans. Thick clouds and heavy anti-aircraft fire scattered the paratrooper formations. German searchlights pierced the night sky, followed by streams of tracer fire that ripped through the darkness. Transport planes shook violently as flak bursts exploded around them. Some aircraft caught fire, plunging in flames to the earth below. Those who jumped faced a storm of chaos. Many were dropped far from their designated zones, sometimes miles away. Some landed in flooded marshes, their heavy gear dragging them underwater before they could cut free. Others landed in orchards, tangled in trees, helpless as German patrols closed in. For many, their first taste of France was one of terror, isolation, and death. Scattered but fighting, and yet, scattered as they were, the paratroopers fought. Small groups of soldiers, sometimes only 2 or 3 men, banded together in the darkness. Without maps, without radios, without commanders, they improvised. They ambushed German convoys, blew bridges with explosives, and sowed confusion in every direction. The Germans, already reeling from sabotage by the French resistance, now faced a ghostly enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Reports flooded in of paratroopers behind lines, of bridges collapsing, of villages erupting in gunfire. To the German command, it seemed as if entire divisions had descended from the sky. Pegasus Bridge on the eastern flank, one of the most daring missions of the night, unfolded. A handful of British glider troops, led by Major John Howard, landed in near silence just after midnight. Their target, a vital crossing over the river Orne, later to be immortalized as Pegasus Bridge. The gliders skidded across the grass, crashing violently but close enough to the bridge for the men to pour out and attack. In a matter of minutes, they overwhelmed the German garrison, securing the bridge intact. It was a textbook assault, swift, surgical, and decisive. Holding Pegasus Bridge would prevent German armor from counterattacking the beaches from the east, a vital link in the chain of invasion. Saint-Mire-Église to the west. The small French town of Saint-Mire-Église became the first town liberated in the invasion. Paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne descended over the town in the middle of the night, many landing directly among German defenders. Fires lit the sky, and tracers cut through the darkness as men fought desperately to secure the streets. In the confusion, Paratrooper John Steele became famously caught on the church steeple, dangling helplessly for hours as the battle raged below. By dawn, Saint-Mire-Église was in American hands. A foothold had been carved deep inside enemy territory. Courage in the dark, though scattered, battered, and outnumbered, the airborne troops accomplished the impossible. Their chaos became their strength. German commanders struggled to understand where the main force was landing. Every explosion, every ambush, every skirmish made them believe the invasion was larger than it truly was. Roads to the beaches were cut. Bridges were blown. Communication lines were severed. When the sun rose over Normandy, German reinforcements found themselves paralyzed. The paratroopers had done their job. The dawn approaches as the sky began to lighten. Paratroopers dug in wherever they could, bracing for counterattacks. Some units had only a fraction of their original strength. Ammunition was low. Medics worked desperately to save the wounded. Yet despite the losses, their courage had bought precious time. Out at sea, the horizon burned with the lights of thousands of ships. The main force of the invasion was coming. The men in the villages, the hedgerows, and the marshes of Normandy had lit the fuse. Now, the explosion of history was about to crash upon the beaches. The longest day was about to begin. Some landed in flooded marshes, their heavy gear dragging them underwater before they could cut free. Others landed in orchards, tangled in trees, helpless as German patrols closed in. For many, their first taste of France was one of terror, isolation, and death. Scattered but fighting, and yet, scattered as they were, the paratroopers fought. Small groups of soldiers, sometimes only 2 or 3 men, banded together in the darkness. Without maps, without radios, without commanders, they improvised. They ambushed German convoys, blew bridges with explosives, and sowed confusion in every direction. The Germans, already reeling from sabotage by the French resistance, now faced a ghostly enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Reports flooded in of paratroopers behind lines, of bridges collapsing, of villages erupting in gunfire. To the German command, it seemed as if entire divisions had descended from the sky. Pegasus Bridge on the eastern flank, one of the most daring missions of the night, unfolded. A handful of British glider troops, led by Major John Howard, landed in near silence just after midnight. Their target, a vital crossing over the River Orne, later to be immortalized as Pegasus Bridge. The gliders skidded across the grass, crashing violently but close enough to the bridge for the men to pour out and attack. In a matter of minutes, they overwhelmed the German garrison, securing the bridge intact. It was a textbook assault, swift, surgical, and decisive. Holding Pegasus Bridge would prevent German armor from counterattacking the beaches from the east, a vital link in the chain of invasion. Saint-Mire-Église to the west. The small French town of Saint-Mire-Église became the first town liberated in the invasion. Paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne descended over the town in the middle of the night, many landing directly among German defenders. Fires lit the sky, and tracers cut through the darkness as men fought desperately to secure the streets. In the confusion, Paratrooper John Steele became famously caught on the church steeple, dangling helplessly for hours as the battle raged below. By dawn, Saint-Mire-Église was in American hands. A foothold had been carved deep inside enemy territory. Courage in the dark, though scattered, battered, and outnumbered, the airborne troops accomplished the impossible. Their chaos became their strength. German commanders struggled to understand where the main force was landing. Every explosion, every ambush, every skirmish made them believe the invasion was larger than it truly was. Roads to the beaches were cut. Bridges were blown. Communication lines were severed. When the sun rose over Normandy, German reinforcements found themselves paralyzed. The paratroopers had done their job. The dawn approaches as the sky began to lighten. Paratroopers dug in wherever they could, bracing for counterattacks. Some units had only a fraction of their original strength. Ammunition was low. Medics worked desperately to save the wounded. Yet despite the losses, their courage had bought precious time. Out at sea, the horizon burned with the lights of thousands of ships. The main force of the invasion was coming. The men in the villages, the hedgerows, and the marshes of Normandy had lit the fuse. Now, the explosion of history was about to crash upon the beaches. The longest day was about to begin. The longest day was about to begin. Chapter 6. The longest day begins. The invasion at dawn, the horizon glowed faintly red as the first light of June 6th, 1944, broke across the English Channel. For the thousands of men crammed into landing craft, shivering in the cold spray of the sea, this dawn was not just another morning. It was the beginning of the greatest seaborne invasion in history. The paratroopers had already struck in the night. Now, the full weight of the Allied war machine moved toward the beaches of Normandy. The Armada revealed when the sun rose higher. The Germans along the coast beheld a sight that defied belief. Stretching across the water, as far as the eye could see, was the Allied fleet. Nearly 7,000 vessels of every type. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, troop carriers, and thousands of landing craft. Never before had humanity gathered such a force. For the men aboard, the night of waiting was over. Chaplains had offered prayers. Letters had been tucked away. Cigarettes smoked in silence. Now the roar of engines and the smell of cordite filled the air. Above them, squadrons of aircraft, fighters, bombers, and transports darkened the skies. In every direction, the world seemed to tremble with the machinery of the naval bombardment. At 5:30 a.m., the order was given. The sea erupted. Battleships opened fire, their massive guns hurling shells the size of small cars into the French coastline. The earth shook as fortifications, bunkers, and artillery positions were pounded into rubble. Destroyers moved in close, strafing with rapid-fire cannons. The beaches of Normandy became an inferno of smoke, dust, and fire. But the Germans endured. Inside their concrete bunkers and dugouts, they braced against the storm. When the bombardment paused, they emerged, manning machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The real test was about to begin. The first wave shortly after 6:30 a.m., the landing craft dropped their ramps. At Utah Beach, American troops of the 4th Infantry Division stormed ashore, aided by currents that accidentally carried them south of their intended zone, a mistake that spared them heavier defenses. Though casualties were lighter than expected, they still fought through mines, barbed wire, and entrenched guns. At Sword Beach, British soldiers pushed through heavy fire to secure vital exits toward camp. At Juno Beach, Canadians faced a storm of resistance, but fought with ferocity, their courage carving a path inland. At Gold Beach, more British forces pressed forward, engineers clearing mines under relentless fire. And then came Omaha Beach, the bloodiest killing ground of D-Day. Omaha, the beach of blood, as the ramps of the first landing craft dropped. American soldiers of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions stepped into hell. German machine guns from the bluffs above raked the shoreline with deadly fire. Mortars exploded among the waves, shredding men before they reached the sand. Many drowned under the weight of their gear as they leapt into water too deep. Others collapsed instantly, cut down before they even fired a shot. The beach offered little cover, only scattered obstacles, metal hedgehogs, and shallow craters. Soldiers pressed themselves against the sand, pinned down, unable to move forward. Officers were killed by the dozens. Entire units were shredded before they could regroup. For hours, Omaha was chaos. The tide turned red. Survivors clung to shattered landing craft, praying for cover that never seemed to come. Naval gunfire roared overhead, but still the German bunkers held. It seemed as if Omaha might be lost, that the invasion itself might collapse on this beach. Courage amid desperation, and yet, amid the slaughter, small groups of men began to crawl forward. Engineers blew holes in barbed wire and obstacles with satchel charges. Riflemen climbed the bluffs under relentless fire, picking off machine gun nests one by one. By sheer willpower, Omaha began to crack. Soldiers who had watched their comrades die refused to stop. They scaled cliffs, stormed pillboxes, and silenced the guns that had slaughtered their brothers. By midday, bloodied and exhausted, they had carved a foothold in the sand. Omaha was not lost. It was won, at a cost so terrible that survivors would remember it for the rest of their lives. The tide of men, as the morning stretched on, wave after wave of soldiers poured ashore. Tanks rumbled across the beaches, some sinking into the waves, others blasting apart bunkers with direct fire. Engineers built makeshift roads from planks and rubble, clearing paths for trucks and artillery. Medics worked furiously, dragging the wounded from the surf, setting up aid stations under fire. By early afternoon, the beaches were alive with movement. What had been chaos became a relentless flow of men and machines pushing it. The Germans, though fierce in defense, could not hold back the tide. The German response inland, German commanders scrambled to react. Confusion reigned. Reports came in of paratroopers, sabotage, and now mass landings. But Hitler, still convinced that Normandy was a diversion, refused to release armored divisions near Calais. His generals pleaded, but the delay was fatal. By the time reinforcements moved, the Allies were already digging in. Rommel himself was not at the front. He had gone to Germany to visit his wife for her birthday, leaving his command fractured at the worst possible moment. The Atlantic Wall, built to stop the invasion, was cracking under the weight of history. The longest day by nightfall on June 6th, the beaches of Normandy were firmly in Allied hands. It had cost more than 10,000 casualties, dead, wounded, and missing, but the impossible had been achieved. The Allies had secured a foothold on the continent. The nightmare of Dunkirk had been reversed. Europe had its first breath of liberation. But for the soldiers who lived through that day, the memory would never fade. They would forever call it the longest day, and beyond the beaches, The battle for France was only just beginning. Chapter 7. Hell on the beaches. Omaha, Utah, gold, Juno, and soared the sun was high over Normandy on June 6, 1944, but for the men on the beaches, the light brought no comfort. Smoke drifted across the coastline. The sea was littered with burning wreckage, overturned landing craft, and the bodies of the fallen. The sand itself was scarred, blackened by fire, soaked in blood. The landings had begun, but the beaches were not yet secure. For the soldiers of the Allied armies, D-Day was not a single moment of triumph. It was hours of unrelenting struggle, fought 1 yard at a time against the teeth of the Atlantic Wall. Omaha, the butcher's ground at Omaha Beach, the horror continued through the morning. The German defenses here were the strongest of all. Steep bluffs, concrete bunkers, machine guns positioned for overlapping fields of fire. Entire landing craft were annihilated before their ramps dropped. Men staggered ashore in waist-deep water, only to be cut down Survivors crawled forward, clinging to hedgehogs and craters, too terrified to lift their heads. Officers and sergeants were among the first to fall, leaving leaderless groups huddled together in shock. For hours, Omaha teetered on the edge of catastrophe. Radio operators sent frantic messages back to the fleet. "We are pinned down. Casualties heavy. Situation critical." Some commanders considered evacuating the beach altogether. And yet, amid the slaughter, courage erupted. Small groups of soldiers began to act on their own initiative. Engineers blew gaps in minefields. Riflemen scaled the bluffs under fire, using bayonets and grenades to silence machine gun nests. Slowly, bunker by bunker, Omaha was cracked open. By late afternoon, bloodied survivors had pushed beyond the shingle line, establishing a fragile hold on the high ground. It had cost more than 2,000 American casualties, but Omaha, once thought lost, had been taken. Utah, the fortunate landing just a few miles to the west, at Utah Beach, the story was very different. American troops of the 4th Infantry Division landed south of their intended zone, carried by strong currents. At first, it seemed disastrous, but fate was kind. Their unexpected landing point was less heavily defended, and resistance was lighter than expected. General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president, was among the first ashore. Limping with arthritis and carrying a cane, he realized a mistake immediately. But instead of panicking, he made a fateful decision. "We'll start the war from right here," he declared. Under his steady leadership, the troops reorganized, pushed inland, and linked with airborne units already fighting in the hedgerows. Utah's cost was light compared to Omaha, about 200 casualties. For the men who lived, it felt almost miraculous. Gold, the British breakthrough at Gold Beach. The British 50th Infantry Division faced heavy resistance, but brought with them new weapons to crack the defenses. Massive armored vehicles, nicknamed Hobart's Funnies, rolled off the landing craft. Tanks equipped with flails to clear mines, bridges to cross obstacles, and flamethrowers to burn out bunkers. The fighting was brutal. German artillery rained shells across the beach. Machine guns cut down advancing infantry. But the specialized tanks proved decisive. By mid-afternoon, the British had punched inland, capturing villages and linking up with Canadian forces at Juno. Gold Beach became one of the strongest Allied footholds of the day. Juno, the Canadian struggle, the Canadians at Juno Beach faced some of the fiercest resistance of the invasion. The first waves were devastated. Half of the landing craft destroyed or disabled before reaching shore. The men who survived the crossing were met with gunfire, mines, and artillery. The beach was a killing ground, but the Canadians fought with relentless determination. By sheer grit, they stormed the defenses, silenced the bunkers, and pushed inland. By nightfall, they had advanced further than any other division on D-Day, nearly reaching the critical road to Cannes. Juno had cost the Canadians nearly 1,000 casualties, but their progress was a testament to raw courage. Sword, the eastern edge on the far left of the invasion front. At Sword Beach, British troops landed with the objective of capturing Cannes, a vital crossroads city. Resistance was fierce, with German artillery hammering the landing zones. The British fought their way off the beach, supported by tanks and engineers. By midday, they had linked up with the airborne troops at Pegasus Bridge, securing the flank from counterattack. However, German resistance stiffened as the day wore on and can remain out of reach. Despite this, sword was held. The eastern flank of the invasion was secure. The cost of victory by nightfall on June 6th, the beaches of Normandy were linked in a single line of Allied control. The Atlantic Wall, once deemed impenetrable, had been breached. The Allies had landed more than 150,000 troops in a single day. But the cost was staggering, over 10,000 casualties with thousands dead. For every beachhead secured, for every yard gained, men had paid with their lives. Yet they had done what many believed impossible. The beaches were theirs. The foothold was secure. The road into France was open. And for the first time in 4 long years, occupied Europe had seen the dawn of liberation. The invasion was far from over. The Germans were regrouping, their armored divisions preparing to strike. The hedgerows of Normandy would become a new battlefield of mud, blood, and fire. But for one day, one longest day, the impossible had been achieved. Chapter 8, Breaking the Atlantic Wall, Blood, Steel, and Sacrifice the evening of June 6th, 1944, did not bring silence to Normandy. Instead, it carried the echo of explosions, the crack of rifles, the whine of artillery, and the screams of the wounded. The Allies had landed, but the fight to hold and expand the beachhead had only just begun. The German Atlantic Wall, once thought impregnable, had not collapsed all at once. It had to be torn down piece by piece with blood and steel. The battle beyond the sand by late afternoon, Allied troops had clawed their way off the beaches. But ahead of them lay the dense countryside of Normandy, fields divided by hedgerows, ancient stone walls, and narrow lanes that turned every skirmish into an ambush. The first objective was simple yet deadly: break through the coastal defenses and secure a line that connected all 5 beaches. This meant storming villages, silencing batteries, and cutting down pockets of resistance still firing on the sands. At Omaha, survivors of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions pushed up the bluffs, their uniforms caked in sand and blood. Every farmhouse, every trench was contested. German defenders, though stunned by the landings, fought with desperate ferocity. By nightfall, the Americans held the high ground, but only at a terrible cost. Engineers and the price of progress behind the infantry, engineers worked furiously. Mines had to be cleared, obstacles demolished, and makeshift roads built to bring tanks and artillery inland. Men carried explosives on their backs, crawling forward under sniper fire to blast apart dragons' teeth and hedgehogs. Bulldozers rumbled ashore, shoving wreckage aside to carve supply routes into the beachheads. For many engineers, their job was suicide. German gunners zeroed in on anyone carrying charges or tools. Still, they pressed forward. Without them, the entire invasion could have stalled on the sand. Their sacrifice turned beaches of death into gateways for an army. The German counterblow, even as the Allies dug in, German commanders scrambled to respond. Scattered reports from Normandy painted a picture of chaos, but one truth became clear. The invasion was real, and it was massive. The 352nd Infantry Division, already stationed near Omaha, had nearly shattered the Americans in the morning. But reinforcements were needed, armored divisions that could smash the fragile beachhead before it solidified. Yet Hitler's obsession with Calais still lingered. Many of his most powerful panzer divisions remained idle, waiting for an attack that would never come. Those that were sent toward Normandy moved slowly, harassed by Allied aircraft that bombed roads, railways, and convoys relentlessly. For the men on the ground, this delay was salvation. Every hour the panzers were kept away meant more Allied troops, more tanks, and more artillery pouring onto French soil. British and Canadian advances to the east, British and Canadian forces pushed inland from Gold, Juno, and Sword. Their objectives included capturing Caen, a city whose crossroads controlled access to the rest of Normandy. But German defenders, including elements of the 21st Panzer Division, counterattacked fiercely. Outside Sword Beach, British units clashed with German armor in one of the first tank battles of the invasion. Though the Germans pressed hard, the British held their ground, aided by naval gunfire from destroyers just offshore. One German armored thrust nearly reached the sea, threatening to split the beachhead, but was repelled at the last moment. For the Canadians at Juno, progress was swift but costly. They cleared villages one by one, often in brutal close-quarters fighting. The Canadians advanced further inland than any other force on D-Day, though every step was paid in blood. American Drive from Utah, meanwhile, at Utah Beach, the 4th Infantry Division linked with the scattered paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne. The airborne soldiers, exhausted from a night of chaos, were battered but unbroken. Together, they held bridges, seized crossroads, and blocked German reinforcements from reaching the coast. This cooperation between landings and airborne forces was critical. Without the paratroopers, German armor could have surged to the beaches at dawn. Instead, the Americans established a firm hold on the Cotentin Peninsula, setting the stage for the eventual drive toward the port of Cherbourg. Nightfall in Normandy as darkness fell on June 6th. The beaches were a vision of devastation. Landing craft lay shattered along the shore. Tanks burned where they had been hit. Bodies still floated in the surf, carried by the tide. Yet behind the carnage, order was emerging. Supply dumps were organized. Ammunition and fuel were unloaded by the ton. Field hospitals filled with the wounded, where medics worked through the night to save lives. Signalmen set up radio towers, linking the invasion to London. The Allies had landed more than 150,000 troops. They had a foothold, and most importantly, they had not been thrown back into the sea. Hitler's mischance in Berlin, Hitler raged. By the time he was fully convinced that Normandy was the true invasion, the critical hours had slipped away. His armored reserves, still waiting for the real attack at Calais, remained out of reach. What could have been a devastating counterstrike became a slow, piecemeal response. The Allies, against impossible odds, had cracked open the Atlantic Wall, but the battle for France was only beginning. Ahead lay weeks of bitter combat in the hedgerows, where every field became a fortress and every advance was measured in blood. The invasion had succeeded. Now came the harder task, breaking out of Normandy. Chapter 9, The Turning Tide, securing Normandy and breaking out by the morning of June 7th, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were no longer invasion points. They were strongholds. The Allies had done the impossible. They had landed, survived, and held against the might of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Yet victory on the sand was only the beginning. To win France and eventually Europe, they had to push inland. What awaited them was not open country, but a maze of hedgerows, villages, and fanatical German resistance. The hedgerow nightmare, the countryside of Normandy, was unlike anything the Allies had trained for. Ancient hedgerows, thick earthen embankments topped with dense shrubs and trees, lined every field and lane. Each one was a fortress. Machine guns and snipers could hide unseen, and tanks struggled to push through without exposing themselves. The Germans, seasoned veterans of years of war, turned every hedgerow into a killing zone. Mortars dropped shells from hidden positions. Machine guns swept open lanes. Anti-tank weapons waited around every corner. Progress was measured not in miles, but in yards. For the Allied soldiers, many just days removed from the beaches, Normandy became a grinder of mud and blood. The German counterattacks, despite the chaos of D-Day, German resistance stiffened quickly. Units of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, comprised largely of fanatical young soldiers, launched counterattacks against the Canadian and British lines near Caen. Their fury shocked even hardened veterans. Casualties on both sides were brutal, villages reduced to rubble as tanks and infantry clashed in street fighting. At Corinton, American airborne units held desperately against waves of German attacks, their thin lines reinforced only by sheer determination. Paratroopers who had dropped in chaos on June 6th now fought as hardened veterans, holding crossroads that were vital to linking Omaha and Utah beaches. The Germans struck hard, but the Allies held firm. Slowly, painfully, the front began to expand. Caen, the stubborn city, the British objective of Caen, just beyond Sword Beach, became one of the most bitterly contested prizes of the campaign. Originally planned to fall on D-Day itself, the city remained under German control for weeks. The Germans understood its importance as a crossroads for Normandy, and they poured men and armor into its defense. British and Canadian troops launched operation after operation, Perch, Epsom, Charnwood, Goodwood, to take the city. Each attack came with heavy casualties, streets reduced to rubble, entire districts flattened by bombers. Lincoln finally fell in mid-July. It was a victory paid for in blood and ash. The American pushed Cherbourg and the Bocage to the west. The Americans turned their focus toward the Cotentin Peninsula and the port city of Cherbourg. Utah Beach had given them a foothold, but Cherbourg was the key to supplying the army. The Germans fought ferociously, retreating into fortified positions and using the rugged terrain to their advantage. It took weeks of fighting through the Bocage, the tangled hedgerow country, before Cherbourg was encircled. The Germans surrendered the city on June 26, 1944, but not before destroying its port facilities. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair the damage, and within weeks supplies were pouring. The air war over Normandy above the hedgerows. The skies belonged to the Allies. Thousands of fighters and bombers patrolled the region, strafing German convoys, destroying bridges, and cutting supply lines. German reinforcements struggled to move by day. Their columns hunted relentlessly. Every road became a death trap. Tanks moved only at night. Ammunition and fuel dwindled. The once feared German blitzkrieg machine found itself paralyzed. Operation Cobra, the breakthrough by late July, after weeks of grinding attrition, the Americans prepared their break. The plan was Operation Cobra, a massive aerial bombardment followed by a lightning ground assault to smash through German defenses near St. Lo. On July 25, 1944, the skies opened. Thousands of Allied bombers dropped their loads in a thunderous bombardment that shattered German positions. When the dust cleared, American tanks and infantry surged forward. This time, the German lines did not hold. Their formations collapsed under the pressure, retreating in disarray. For the first time since D-Day, the front was no longer crawling forward. It was racing. The Falaise pocket as the Americans poured south and west. The British and Canadians pushed east. The German army in Normandy, once confident of driving the Allies back into the sea, now faced encirclement. In August, near the town of Falaise, the Allies closed the trap. Tens of thousands of German troops were surrounded. The fighting in the pocket was merciless. Bombers, artillery, and tanks turned the countryside into a slaughter ground. Roads were clogged with wreckage. Columns of retreating soldiers annihilated from the air. Though some German units escaped, the bulk of their forces in Normandy were destroyed. The once proud Wehrmacht had been bled dry. Liberation of Paris with the German army shattered. The road to Paris lay open. In late August, Allied forces advanced rapidly, greeted as liberators by the French people. The city rose in revolt, the resistance striking at the occupiers from within. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. Crowds filled the streets, tears streaming as Allied tanks rolled past the Arc de Triomphe. General Charles de Gaulle marched proudly down the Champs-Élysées, declaring that France had risen again. The promise of D-Day, the return to Europe, was now reality. The tide turns Normandy had been won, but at a terrible price. The Allies suffered more than 200,000 casualties, and the countryside was devastated. Villages were reduced to ruins, fields churned into graves. Yet the strategic victory was undeniable. The Atlantic Wall had been broken, the German army in the west crippled, and the road to Germany itself was now open. The tide of war had turned. From this point forward, it would flow inexorably toward Berlin. Chapter 10: The Road to Liberation. How D-Day changed the war. Forever the guns of Normandy eventually fell silent, but their echo carried across the world. The beaches of France, Omaha, Utah Gold, Juno Sword, were no longer just names on a map. They became sacred ground, places where the tide of history had turned. The Allied victory on D-Day was not just the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. It was the start of the liberation of an entire continent. The weight of sacrifice by the end of August 1944, the Allies had advanced beyond Normandy. Paris was liberated, and the German army was in retreat. But none of it had come easily. The Normandy campaign alone had cost the Allies more than 200,000 casualties, with tens of thousands dead. The Germans had suffered even more. Nearly 400,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. For the soldiers who fought there, the memories would never fade. The roar of naval guns, the smoke over the beaches, the cries of comrades cut down in the surf. For the French civilians, liberation came at a heavy price as their towns and villages were caught in the crossfire. Yet through this sacrifice, the door to freedom had been forced open. The strategic earthquake D-Day's impact was far greater than the land itself. It forced Germany to fight a two-front war it could not win. To the east, the Soviet Union was already grinding the Wehrmacht down in titanic battles. Now, to the west, an unstoppable Allied army had landed. Germany's fate was sealed. Within months, Allied armies would push across France, through Belgium, and into the Netherlands. By the winter of 1944, they would stand at Germany's borders. The Reich that once stretched across Europe was shrinking, battered from both directions. D-Day had made that possible. Without Normandy, there could have been no liberation, no advance on Berlin, no final collapse of the Nazi Empire. The human stories amid the sweeping strategies and grand battles. D-Day was also the story of individuals. The paratrooper who landed alone in a hedgerow, cut off but determined to fight. The young Canadian who charged across Juno Beach despite the machine guns tearing his unit apart. The British glider troops who seized Pegasus Bridge in the first hour of the invasion. The American infantrymen who crawled through the blood-soaked sand of Omaha and somehow kept moving forward. Their names may be lost to history, but their courage shaped the world we live in. Liberation and hope for the people of France. The arrival of Allied troops was the dawn of freedom. After 4 years under Nazi occupation, years of fear, hunger, and oppression, the sight of Allied tanks rolling through their streets brought tears, cheers, and uncontainable joy. Women waved flags from windows. Children chased after convoys. Bells that had been silent rang out once more. But liberation was not just about reclaiming cities. It was about restoring hope. Each village freed, each flag raised, each soldier who shook the hand of French farmer reminded the world that tyranny could be defeated. Lessons of D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, stands as one of history's greatest military operations, but its true lesson lies beyond strategy. It showed that free nations, when united, could overcome even the darkest tyranny. It showed the value of sacrifice, of courage in the face of impossible odds. It showed that history is not only shaped by generals and leaders, but by the ordinary soldiers who dared to keep moving forward when everything seemed lost. The road to Berlin from the beaches of Normandy, the road led inexorably to Berlin. Less than a year later, in May 1945, Nazi Germany would fall. Hitler was dead. The Reich was no more. Europe, though scarred and broken, was free. The liberation that began on June 6, 1944, did not just change the course of the war, it changed the course of the century. The legacy today: the beaches of Normandy are quiet. The sand is clean, the water's calm. Tourists walk where once men fought and died. Cemeteries stretch across the hills, rows upon rows of white crosses and stars of David marking the resting places of those who never came home. Each grave is a reminder of what was won and what it cost. Each beach is a monument not just to victory, but to sacrifice. D-Day is remembered not only as a battle, but as a testament to the courage of a generation who stood against tyranny and changed the world forever. The final reflection: on June 6, 1944, the fate of the world hung in the balance. Had the Allies failed, Hitler's grip on Europe might have endured for years more. But they did not fail. They endured, they bled, they triumphed. D-Day was the day Europe began to breathe again. The day freedom returned to a continent. The day the tide of war turned forever. And so, the story of Normandy is not only about how the Allies took back Europe. It is about how humanity reclaimed hope from the jaws of despair. If you found this journey through history powerful, make sure to subscribe and join us again. Here, we bring the battles, the choices, and the what-ifs of history to life, so that the past is never forgotten.